So officially, friends, welcome to Temple Beth Israel's adult education mini-series on the laws of Teshuva for ourselves as individuals, for our collective communities, and as pertains to racial justice. This is the first of 3 classes. I'm Rabbi Ruhi Sophia, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am really interested in embarking on this exploration with all of you. So, thank you so much to Mark Watson, who has just shared in the chat the link to the PDF of the Maimonides Laws of Teshuva document for those who don't have it. When this posts online, we will make sure this link is also in the comments on our YouTube section, on our YouTube page. So I invite you to open that document or make sure you otherwise have access to it as we go through the evening, because we will be referring to it. And in the course description, we mentioned there would be some guided journaling prompts as well throughout this course. So I encourage you to either have an open Microsoft Word or Google Doc or whatever other your document, your word processing document of choice is, or to have a hard copy, old-fashioned journal and pen or pencil available to you for some of this time. So the first thing we are going to do is I'm going to ask you to just journal about what your associations are with Teshuva. It can be long form sentences or bullet points. This is just for you, although I will invite people to share in the chat afterwards. I'm going to set an alarm for 2 minutes. Just what are your associations with the notion of Teshuva coming into this course? Go. All right, that is our 2 minutes. So being as this is an interactive course, I invite you either in the chat or to unmute yourself and say your name and share, an association of Teshuva, either a complete sentence or even just a phrase.
Hi, I'm Devin. A lot of this ties in with my own Buddhist background too. The first thing that came to mind is there is no lotus without mud. You can't. Teshuvah is how we become fully realized.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for being the brave soul to go first.
I'm Sabina. A lot of what I learned about Teshuva, I learned through a 12-step program, and learned that Teshuva does not mean saying you're sorry. That doesn't create any repair. That repair is necessary. And also Teshuva isn't happening when you tell people about harms you've done that they may not know about just to make yourself feel better. That you can't create more harm doing Teshuva by doing Teshuva.
Well, I
hope it's okay, folks, that as you might see, I am taking notes in the chat based on what you've said. If you don't consent to me noting what you have said, let me know as you start talking.
Well, I really appreciate what you said, Sabrina. My name is John, and I was not going to put in my 12-step experience because I directly related this Teshuva to my 12-step, working on my 4-step, and it specifically not about me being bad and wrong, but simply I like the Jewish tact on it of missing the mark, and looking at how I can change my behavior. And I really like the readings going into that very aspect too, of how we look at deeper into ourselves.
Thank you, John. I'm going to ask, not everybody needs to talk, but I really do want to encourage all of you to share at least one associative phrase in the chat. Go ahead, Virginia.
Virginia. Hi, I'm Virginia. I think that the thing I think about is picking up on what everybody else said, that it can't, you have to go to the other human. I can't go between God for Teshuva, my understanding.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Marion, and my understanding of it also came from 12-step. Funny. Part of it is examining myself carefully to see what part I had in whatever problem I'm identifying, instead of trying to identify what some other person may have done to me. I need to know what I have done. What is my part, and what is it about me that has brought me there? And then doing something about it. Action, not words.
Thank you, Marion. And just this is a good note from Marion and Jacob and anyone else who might be in the same household with another person in the course. If you're in the same household, please try to make sure you are not both unmuted at once. And I love what I am seeing in the chat. Question: attempt at can a murderer do teshuva? Attempt at reconciliation, deep introspection, reflection of my behaviors, facing myself, atonement, and at one-ment. All right, Jacob, I assume you keep unmuting yourself because you would like to tell us something, so go ahead.
Sorry about that. This is our first time. Yeah, this is not going to work. I'm going to move to another room. For me, this was a huge part of my conversion. The idea, well, actually, Tikkun Olam, and for me, this is a huge part of Tikkun Olam, the idea that when I repair the wrong I've done, I'm repairing the world. And I really, that was the original thing that spoke to me about Judaism, is the opportunity to take ownership, to do healing before God. I don't want to get into a Christianity, Judaism thing, but the idea that I owe it to man first and then to God is really important to me.
Thank you. Okay. I think we are bringing out a lot of great insights about Teshuva, and I really appreciate all of you for sharing. I really particularly appreciate the invocation of the 12-step model, because as I study Teshuva, the more I think about it, the more I conclude that Teshuva is like recovery, in that to the extent that we take it really seriously, it is a process that is never finished, which can both feel very burdensome, like, oh no, I have to spend my whole life doing this. And I would suggest can also be very freeing, in that we are at no point expecting perfection of ourselves. To be engaged with Teshuva is to be engaged in a lifelong process of intent and action, and perhaps continuing to miss the mark and continuing to circle back towards doing better. I really appreciated Devin's comment, because I think it is actually very similar to mindfulness practices that have been popularized in the West by the Buddhist traditions. That is not about being in a state of constant enlightenment, but about the practice of straying from the path and then re-engaging. So perfect people don't get to do teshuva because they have never messed up And our tradition says that the tzaddik cannot stand in as holy a place as a Baal Teshuva. The tzaddik, the person who is entirely righteous, who has done no wrong, is lacking some core human experience that is necessary in the striving towards holiness that only one who has messed up and striven to do teshuva and remains striving to do teshuva can have. So I encourage us to sort of hold that intention as we delve into this work. The tzaddik cannot stand in the place of the Baal Teshuva, and so we are striving to be Baalei Teshuva, practitioners of teshuva, learners of teshuva, who can bring ourselves to a holier space. So I want to delve a little bit into the learning, and so here are the questions I'm going to ask. For those of you who have done the reading, I'm going to put you in small groups of 3 or 4 screens and ask you, we're going to take 10 minutes, and those of you who have already done the reading, please discuss the specific steps of teshuva that seemed most challenging to you, and what you might learn from engaging with them. And please discuss whether you feel that you have ever experienced teshuva, either been on the true teshuva, either been on the receiving end of it or been on the practicing end of it, and what that experience was like. So for those of you in the breakout rooms who have already done the reading, please discuss whether you have ever, please discuss what was challenging for you about these definitions of teshuva, what you learned from those challenges, and please discuss if you have ever been on the receiving end of teshuva. For those of you joining the breakout rooms who did not do the reading in advance, please do the reading together and then discuss just the first question. What is challenging for you and what might you learn from those challenges? So I'm creating 8 breakout rooms. Breakout rooms 1 and 2 are for people who did not do the reading in advance. Everybody else did the reading in advance and should select into 3 to 8. So we're going to try this. I've never done breakout groups where I've let participants choose their room before. So I hope this works.
Will you talk about the exile question?
Sure. Do you want to frame the question a little bit?
Yeah.
Do you want to articulate the question a little more?
Right. So number 4.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the modes of how one does teshuva.
Change your name and go into exile.
Mm-hmm.
Leaving the community. Is that a permanent? Is that like prison? Is that like leaving the city?
Let's, so it's a great question, and let's zoom out a little bit more. Sorry, I didn't, no pun intended. But I think to answer that question, I guess I want to point out some tensions that are inherent in this text. And Rabbi Ethan Tucker's article, which was an optional reading, discusses these. So if you read that, apologies for the redundancy. But so we see within Maimonides' text this sense of different and perhaps competing, mutually exclusive definitions of teshuva. So on the one hand, even within our very first halacha in chapter 2, where he seeks to start defining teshuva, teshuva is defined as you are in the exact same situation where you committed the sin and you don't do it. You've had such a transformation that you can manage to avoid the transgression under the exact same circumstances. But to call back to our recovery metaphor, that is A, really hard, and B, probably unadvisable. A more realistic model for Teshuva is to seek to avoid temptation, is to, in the process of transformation, work a little harder to set oneself up for success, or to set oneself up to be in a different state. So I think, so we have this definition that starts as Teshuva Gemura, which is, what we translate as complete Teshuva. You can be in the same situation and behave differently. And then you have these models of, other ways that people do Teshuva. And so I read halacha number 4 as part of that next best definition of Teshuva. If you can't become a completely different person who behaves in completely different ways, here are some things you should do to sort of train yourself away from the behavior and be in recovery. Now, this is going to get obviously complicated as we apply this to a racial justice conversation. Because when it comes to racial justice and microaggressions, what we may be talking about as individuals as well as communities is actually that very process of we find ourselves in the exact same kind of situation and wanting to behave in a different way. So let's hold that Maimonidean value of Teshuva Gemura as a really high value. This is a 3-part course, though. So tonight is going to be focused a little more generally on just on the general ideas of how we do Teshuva and reckon with interpersonal harm. And often on the way to becoming an entirely different person, we need to be putting into place practices of mindfulness that actually prevent ourselves from being in the kind of situation where we can do the kind of harm that we've done in the past. Does that make sense? Or does anyone want to challenge that or problematize that? Please, it is my intention to be sort of a learner with you all here.
So
Rabbi
one thing
Ruhi, sorry.
Let's have Kel first, and then I think Devin.
So hi, I'm Kel Weinhold. Rabbi Ruhi, I just wanted to say that I appreciated your bracketing that around the issue of racial justice, because for me, number 4 was a really valuable, the returning over and over again to the same thing was a really valuable one to explore around that issue as you framed it for this course. So I just wanted to say thanks for pointing that out, because I was starting to go, but, so thank you.
And I partially saw that in your face, so I'm glad. Thank you for showing me that. Devin, please go ahead.
So I was thinking about what you were saying is trying to avoid getting into the same situation. Avoidance is a hard topic for me. There's a strong sense of fear. There's this sense of, if you're afraid, what I'd want to suss out is like, if you're afraid of being in a certain situation, what happens when you're in that situation? You're coming in activated, you're coming in from a pretty destabilized place. And I of course don't think it's good to like try and pursue where you were, where you messed up. But I also think that avoidance for me in the ways that I've needed to improve, avoidance has actually been, has led me to resist and fear change.
Great point. And so we start to problematize the Maimonidean text. Let's say the obvious problematic, which no one has named yet. Maimonides, in his example, has an extremely problematic example because, let's break this down. His example of a sin requiring teshuva is of a sexual transgression which he is defining as a violation ben adam lamakom, as a violation against God. And there's no discussion about whether that sexual transgression is also a violation against another human being. It gets a lot more complicated if you assume that that sexual transgression is also a violation against a human being. And so there's this piece that, like, his quintessential definition of his example of a sin is of a sexual sin, which in our contemporary understanding, we might ask a lot of questions, problematizing, is the encounter, we're talking about a consensual encounter. Are there power dynamics that make it problematic, let alone the whole question of, is it a relationship that is forbidden by Torah or not? But all of that is to say, to the extent that we think about a recovery model, sometimes there are behaviors, there are transgressions of appetite that we best avoid by not subjecting ourselves to temptation. And I think while both honoring your point about fear, it's also important to honor that and to say, like, it is not shameful, it is not cowardly for a person who, to take sort of the most obvious example, for a person who is in recovery from alcoholism to choose to never go into a bar. That's not a cowardly choice. That is a choice of discipline to help with their discipline and their ongoing recovery. At the same time, right, we might call a lot of those practices that are of appetite kind of on the ben adam lemakom, the between human and God or between human and themselves issue. When we start talking about interpersonal teshuva, it becomes a lot messier to think about avoidance. And that's why, when I was first drafting the text sheet for this class, I kind of wanted to keep it to 2 pages, and I almost didn't include the texts at the end. But I think these texts are really key about how teshuva, as is defined in a intrapersonal or between a human being and God, is a very different project than teshuva on an interpersonal level. And it gets even more complicated when we think about a transgression, such as it were, that is all of these things, that is intrapersonal, interpersonal, and perhaps against God, howsoever we define God, as our values, as the idea of the world for which we strive, as that which is greater than ourselves, to which we are obligated. So, like, yes to the problem. So let's go back to exile. I hoped someone would find this halacha number 4, a problematic one, because this halacha number 4 comes probably closest to all of these to mistaking aspiration for completion, right? This claim, I am not the person that I was before. I feel really bad about what I did. I am not the person that I was before. I'm going somewhere else. I'm changing my name. I'm a new person. Is a classic sort of putting the aspiration ahead of the work. And what I mean by that is, to use a Torah example, is the sin of Korach in the book of Numbers. Korach gets in trouble because he goes to Moshe and says, why are you raising yourself up before the people? All the people Israel are holy. Why should you be leading us? And Korach makes this classic mistake. The mitzvah is not all the people Israel are holy in Leviticus 19:1. The mitzvah is you shall be holy. You shall strive to be holy. You shall work to be holy, which is not the same thing as you are holy. So likewise with teshuva, I strive to be a different person. I strive to do differently than I have done in the past, is a really different and probably more truthful statement than I am a different person. I do not behave in this way. So for our purposes, perhaps we challenge, so, or transvalue this text. Sabina, if I were to like loosely translate this text just for myself, I would say, I would translate change their name to change the story I tell about myself. Part of Teshuva is changing the story I tell about who I am in the world to be a more truthful story. And go into exile, I would loosely translate as leave my comfort zone. Expose myself to new ideas, let myself be challenged by things that I have not allowed to challenge me before. So that's how I can sort of, embrace this text and somewhat stretch it and transvalue it. But this has been me doing a lot of talking, and to be fair, that's probably appropriate in some balance because you're here hoping that I will teach you something. But let's hear about some other challenges that came up for you all with the text that we can discuss.
To me, there are two things. One was, what number? The one that says you should hold it in your heart. So it's not only doing it, but also committing, in your heart to, where is that? Number 3, I think.
About this great metaphor of the mikvah in Halacha 3, chapter 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, but the holding the unclean creature, that's not necessarily a problem to me. The one is the commit in your heart to abandon, because that says, not only is the act enough, but you have to have more in there in the heart, it says. And while I find, great if you get to that, I always thought the act is usually more important than the intention or the thought, right? If you do good, that's good. And sometimes you might not have the perfect intention, but if you are doing good. And so all about, the habit, the way of life, the actions. And here it is asking or saying that you need way more. So I paused there, and so something that has to process. And the other thing is the one that talks about the rabbi, that if someone does not accept your, your penitence, you go 3 times. But if it's the rabbi, then you go 1,000 times. And I thought, oh, shouldn't the rabbi, on the contrary, be the one to be a bit more, perhaps, more understanding and more open and more embracing, So those are the 2 things.
Great questions. Let's talk about both of them. Does anyone, before I tackle either of them, does anyone else want to say anything about those halachot, those laws? Okay, so halacha number 3, law number 3 in chapter 2 about I just love this metaphor, that it's like you are trying to cleanse yourself in a mikvah while holding an object that conveys impurity, a creepy crawly. So a couple things to keep in mind. In all pre-modern Hebrew literature, the lev, the heart, is not the seat of emotion. Some of you have heard me talk about this. The heart is the seat of intellect and intention. So wherever Hebrew, it's what we would metaphorically refer to as the mind. The seat of emotion is the liver in Hebrew literature. So it's not about feeling bad when it says that we must set the intention in our heart. It's about a mental intention. And let's see what it is in, let's notice what it's in contrast to. It doesn't say anyone who stops doing the transgression but doesn't have a particular intention about it. It's as if they have held a sheretz in the mikveh, a creepy crawly while going in the ritual bath. It says anyone who confesses with words but doesn't set the intention to stop doing the action is as if they're holding the creepy crawly. So I read this halacha, I think just differently than you did, Monique, that it is saying that a cheap apology is not enough. That you don't just say, I'm sorry, or wow, I really regret that. That a necessary next thing is the really setting an intention to not do this again.
Okay. And this, and right after saying the verbal apology is necessary. So there needs to be a verbalization of the
Right. It's I think it's
but
a
it cannot be a cheap one. That's
right. It's essentially mandating sincerity. Right. You need to confess. You need to, part of Teshuva is saying what you've done out loud, but also you need to mean it. And it's not complete Teshuva with either just the one or the other. Great. I got a private chat from someone pointing out the phrase optical allyship. I know some of us have done some work with Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy workbook. And optical allyship is defined as doing the acts of allyship that are easy and public and get one points for being woke without actually doing any of the work that inconveniences ourselves or demands of ourselves to show up in solidarity. So yes, we could say this particular halacha about the intention versus just the verbal apology is a halacha against optical allyship. As for the Rav, the rabbi, yeah, I considered just excising that phrase, but I thought it would be fun to discuss. The rabbis are super elitist, down to Maimonides. And one of the most painful things in reading Talmud, some of you studied Daf Yomi, and we're in Masachet Pesachim, the tractate of Talmud dealing with Pesach. And one of the most painful things, particularly in this Masachet, is reading all of the terrible assumptions that the rabbis make about the common Jews and how ignorant they are and how violent they are. And at one point they say, ugh, you might as well gut an Am Haaretz like a fish. An Am Haaretz is a person of the land. So the rabbis are terribly elitist and they give themselves all sorts of slack, and that is reflected in this halakha. I presume it wouldn't reflect well on a rabbi who refused to forgive a disciple. But I think it's worth just naming as we go into this work that some halachot, particularly halachot around shmirat halashon, guarding the tongue, lashon hara, while in their biblical origins are very universal and liberatory, got formulated later by the rabbis to very much protect their own power. And like any elite group, some of the laws that they create are about protecting their own power. And I think we see that here with this line in Maimonides that gives rabbis more license to be unforgiving than the common person. I'm not going to offer an apologetic for that one, but also it would look bad if I did. So if someone else wants to offer an apologetic, you're welcome to.
I guess I read it a little different. I thought it was talking about things coming more difficult to that you would bring more difficult things to a rabbi, or a rabbi might be more inclined to hold you to, are you really repentant? Have you really done the work? I read it much more positively for the rabbi than you are, which probably means you know more than I do.
Well, I'm not going to assume that. I haven't gone into depth about in the commentaries on any of these halachot, but I guess that makes me want to say one thing that is very important to understand about this text, because nobody has named this as a problematic yet. The assumption that someone is required to forgive, which is difficult, but let us be very clear that that is predicated on complete restitution. So anyone, rabbi or no, has the right to be skeptical about whether the teshuva is complete. And the presumption that someone has the right to ask for forgiveness doesn't even come into play, as this text says, until there has been complete confession, complete attempt to make every sort of restitution possible, and complete demonstration of changed behavior. Everybody has the right to refuse to forgive absent those conditions.
Concept
Rabbi
of
Ruhi, so, but Maimonides is writing at a very different time from those rabbis in the Talmud. So I'm just trying to think, is it kind of writing, thinking, and operating the same environment, so as to speak, like the same thing? Because he's in a different place in a different time, like 1,000 years maybe later. So would he be thinking of the rabbis the same way, that, as they appear in the Talmud, or as they have behaved then?
So this is a good question, and I could take a minute now to see if this halacha is based on a specific quote from the Talmud. I don't off the top of my head know, but I'm happy to check, and I'm sorry for not having
I
checked
can
that
do
out
that later
beforehand.
too. I mean, don't need to take time. We can do that later. If
Maimonides is living about 600 years after the redaction of the Gemara, the secondary layer of Talmud, and he's living in a different, as you said, he's living in Egypt. The Babylonian Talmud is in Babylon, but he is living in a similarly socially stratified milieu. So I wouldn't have expected, certain things. Maimonides' theology is extremely different from the theology of the rabbis. He's living in the Muslim world, which
he was in Spain
arguably
first, right? And then he
only
went to Egypt.
beginning to exist at the time that the Talmud was redacted. So his theology is very different, but his social sensibility is not particularly more evolved.
My understanding was there's sort of, this was actually out to me by an Orthodox Jew on a plane where I was a little captive, but through time, our understanding of spiritual biblical knowledge has changed. The the Tanaim and the Amoraim were wiser than we were, and so if we look at what they said and we can't question it. And so that may be part of it too, is something that I've always found intellectual game with the Mishnah is the Mishnah starts with, this is a premise and we have to explain why it's true. Instead of the baseline question, is this true? And there is something that it's like, we make the assumption that because a rabbi is a rabbi, they are more knowledgeable. And we start with that presupposition instead of moving on to, is that true? Because it comes from far in the knowledge lineage.
So, I could be convinced by you and Jacob that the intent of this text is based on an idea that the rabbi, I assume you're talking about the text about the rabbi, you have to go and beg forgiveness even 100 times, that the intent of this text is based on the idea that the rabbi somehow is holding a standard that maybe you don't understand, and that's why you have to do more teshuva. My doubt about that is that it's not what it says, because essentially it's talking about a situation where a person is essentially refusing to talk to you. It's not talking about a situation where a person is saying, well, you haven't made restitution, here's what I still need to see, which would be a very different case and which anyone has the right to do. So, and I want to say just a comment about Reconstructionist Judaism. The idea you just invoked, Devin, is this idea of Yeridat HaDorot, that every generation is less holy, less connected to revelation than the generations that came before. That is a thing that some Jews believe. And I think, it's an interesting and useful counterweight to the mythology of constant progress that Western capitalism offers us. But I think neither are super true or super useful on their own. And as a Reconstructionist Jew, I am very moved by the notion of accumulation of Torah. So we remain in conversation with the Tanaim and the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Mishnah and the rabbis of the Talmud and the medieval masters, and those who canonized Torah itself. And all of it gets accrued to Torah. Torah is ever expanding. So we don't say we know better than they do, but I'm also not interested in saying that they necessarily know so much better than we do. But that as we are in conversation with them, our one advantage is that we know what they think, and we know what they said, and we know what we think.
And they don't know what we think.
That's true. That's the advantage we have over them. But that doesn't mean that we're smarter than them. It just means we have an advantage in the conversation. So we're getting a little off the topic of teshuva. Let's take a little journaling break. And I know some of you started to discuss this already, but please journal about a teshuva that you have not done, that you know is incomplete, and what is in the way of doing it for you. This is not something that anyone is going to need to report back from, but the question I will ask that folks are going to be welcome to answer, if you would like, when we're done, is what, if anything, did you learn in these few minutes of journaling? So we're going to take 5. What is a teshuva that you know that you are called to do that is not complete, and what has been in the way of doing it? All right, friends, that's time. I will start and say I did that journaling too, and it was quite revelatory for me. I probably spent about a minute experiencing self-protective amnesia. I was like, there's no teshuva I haven't done. And then I just kind of started writing about things that I know I don't do very well. And I had this like, poof, light bulb of, oh, here's a naughty situation. So I don't know if anyone else had a similar feeling or wants to share any reflections. Please do not share with us. I think we are in general, I'm going to make a request of a classic confidentiality model of this group, that folks are welcome to share learnings that you're taking from the group without sharing specifics of something that anyone said. But we are too large a group for me to be able to promise confidentiality to everyone with vulnerable things. So please don't share the details of what you wrote with us. But if there's anything you learned that you'd like to share, especially if you haven't shared much already this evening, I encourage you to do so.
I could talk a little bit about, I didn't necessarily think of this as Teshuva, but when I started journaling, it came to me, and it's just has to do with an interpersonal relationship. And one of the barriers that I realized is feeling like the fear that the conversation could actually make things worse, and that maybe I don't have the communication skills, or the two of us don't have the communication skills together to address the problem. So when you ask the question of like what could be a barrier to doing it, I feel like it might be it. And it has occurred to me that we might need some help with this issue, which reminded me of the text and talking about bringing other people with you, like being two friends or something. And I wonder if part of that might be, I don't know, if that could be helpful, have some support and some other ideas and some other perspectives.
Thank you for sharing, Jessica. And I think that is the wisdom of the Maimonidean instruction about bringing friends. That sometimes it is not worth it for two individuals to reconcile for the sake of their own relationship, but they will be willing to reconcile for the sake of the community, or for the sake of not forcing their friends to have to be triangulated.
This took me a while to access. I thought I had nothing at first, but there are people in my life who have passed away without our really resolving issues, shall we say. And I'll never be able to directly have teshuva with them in this lifetime. It doesn't mean I cannot have teshuva with the relationship within myself.
Right. That's the combination of the internal dynamic with the interpersonal dynamic.
I think I resonate a little bit with that, although my person who I need to do teshuva with is still very much with us. I think that I'm a little bit the barrier because I also want them to do teshuva for me. And so how do I remove my like ongoing bitterness or resentfulness, or this idea of quid pro quo? Like, I really want to heal us, but you and so I want you to do that too. So trying to figure out a way to like come to a place of peace and at one minute, like within myself about it. Sorry, excuse the kittens, they're little.
Darling.
So that I can go with like a real genuine heart to try and make teshuva or do teshuva with this person for the sake of our family and our community, but also for my own well-being and for their own well-being, without expecting anything in return, I think is where my struggle is.
This is such a great point. So we don't do effective teshuva by lying or by denying our truths. And it is very tricky to go to someone and say, honestly, I still have legitimate grievances with you that have not been addressed. And here is where I know I have done wrong and I want to do better. And I would say that's how it has to happen if we're going to try to do teshuva, not to lead with, I acknowledge that, the rift in our relationship is all my fault, if that's not true. So many good insights. Okay, Well, we have been at this for almost an hour and a half, so we are going to move towards closing and let everybody get some sleep. But I want to let you know what's coming up next. So I'm going to give an unofficial no accountability assignment, which is related to the journaling you just did, we all just did, which is if you thought of something where you need to do Teshuva, take some steps towards doing it. I'm not going to hold you accountable at all. It's just a suggestion. But we will hold some time at the beginning of next class for, folks who want to share anything you learned from attempting to do that, to share. I will send out some articles before our next class that will relate this to some other texts and bring our conversation a little bit closer to the conversation about racial justice. And I invite you in the coming week to do some reflection or journaling for yourself on what makes you nervous, if anything, about applying learning about Teshuva to the idea of racial justice. And or in what way, if any way, do you feel resistant to applying the idea of Teshuva personally to a conversation about racial justice? So I'm going to say those again. You can journal on variations on this question. What, if anything, makes you nervous about applying the conversation about Teshuva to a conversation about racial justice? And or how, if at all, do you feel resistant to bringing these two ideas together? How does that resistance show up? And we'll take a look at that next class. We're going to close with some intention. So I invite you to check your posture and straighten it out to the extent that you are able. If you will feel the most lift by standing, I invite you to stand. If you will feel more lift just sitting comfortably, I invite you to sit and feel lift. I invite you to roll your shoulders back with me and take a deep breath that fills your chest and your belly. And sort of flicking your hands down, an exhale that releases it all. And we'll do that again. So thank you for our time together this evening. If you have any feedback or requests in advance of our next class, please do not hesitate to reach out. Please reach out and let me know. And if anyone wants to write like a word of what you're taking away with you in the chat as you leave, I'd love to see that too.